Shalom and welcome to the introduction to the book of Nehemiah, name meaning comfort of Jehovah. So why are we reading this book now? Where does the book of Nehemiah fit into the chronology? Well, we know the events starting the story of Nehemiah are in 445 BC. How do we know that? Well, verse 1, chapter 1 says that it was in the 20th year. 20th year of what? We later find out in chapter 2, verse 1, that it was the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes reigned in Persia from 465 to 424 BC. Therefore, this is 445 BC. When we read the book of Ezra, we find that Ezra returned to Jerusalem, leading the second wave of exiles in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, which would have been 458 BC. So the events of Nehemiah are happening 13 years later. Both of these two men, given divine favor, Jehovah using the king of Persia, King Artaxerxes. Oops, other direction. So who is the author of the text? Verse 1 of chapter 1 says the author is Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. We find out later he's the governor of Jerusalem at the time. We find out in verse 11 of chapter 1 that he's the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. He's the one that holds the wine, tastes the wine, smells the wine, evaluates the wine that the emperor, the king of the known world, really, is going to drink. So you can imagine the trusted position that this individual had to have to ensure that the king wouldn't be poisoned. This is Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes I, who chose Esther as his wife. This makes Artaxerxes the stepson of Queen Esther. Very interesting to consider. Xerxes I was assassinated by an advisor not too many years after he chose Esther as his queen. So this gives a little bit more insight into the background, again, why the cupbearer would be so important. If the life of the king is regularly being threatened, and in this case, his father had been assassinated. It also gives a little bit of insight into the character of this person, Nehemiah, and potentially the influence that Queen Esther had in getting him this position. Of course, she being a Jew, her identity being revealed in the story of the book of Esther, as we know, potentially had a play in how this man Nehemiah, a Jew, obviously, rose to the position that he had. Nehemiah leads the third return of the exiles in 445 BC, the third and final of the returns spoken of, the major returns from Babylonian exile. And as I already said, he's a contemporary of Ezra the scribe. Only 13 years apart in the primary events written about in the books of their respective names. So these two were definitely contemporaries, and they are mentioned in close connection with each other as you read their books. And actually, originally, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book together, considered one book. And they're closely connected with the Book of Chronicles, because the Book of Chronicles ends with the events of this time, which is why it's thought that Ezra also wrote the Book of Chronicles. And we'll find out later as we study the Book of Malachi that it's believed Malachi was prophesying during this time based on some of the themes that we'll study then. So this is our running timeline. As I keep mentioning, you look at the arrows down below, the green, the white, and the orange arrows. The white arrow is indicating when Ezra returned to lead the second group of exiles back to Jerusalem, and the green is when Nehemiah returned 13 years later to lead the third return of the exiles. Ezra is writing about these events in his book called the Book of Ezra, but in the first handful of chapters of his book, he's writing about the events of the very first return of the exiles under Zerubbabel, a long time before, as you can see there in the orange arrow, 538 BC. And I keep emphasizing that to show that the book of Ezra is describing a period long time before him and his current events. And you can see there that the books of Haggai, Zechariah, and Esther are all happening in between the first and second return of exiles that Ezra writes about. So, what is the setting of the story of the book of Nehemiah? Well, there's two physical locations, Susa and Jerusalem. Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king of Persia. So the book starts out in Persia, in the capital city of Susa. But obviously he's returning back to Judah, back to Jerusalem. So the majority of the book takes place in Jerusalem itself, again in 445 BC. Chapters 1 through 12 are about Nehemiah really returning to help restore and rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, restoring the city and restoring protection to the city. This is what he was given permission by Artaxerxes to do. So that's taking place in Jerusalem. Just as a little tidbit, I found there are external, extra-biblical confirmations to not just the events of the story, but some of the characters who are described in the story. Provincial officials, Sanballat, Yochanan, Tobiah, Geshem, Bigvai. These are all names that are mentioned in the text. And we have stamps and coins and inscriptions and stones from the surrounding area, Elephantine, Egypt, Samaria, Jordan, from this time period, specifying officials according to these names. So just a little extra biblical archaeological confirmation to the biblical text. The very last chapter, Nehemiah says that he leaves Jerusalem for a time, doesn't say how long, about 12 or 13 years after he initially got there, and he comes back. So there's just to show that there was a time where he went back to Persia, to the capital city of Susa, to Artaxerxes, returned to Jerusalem, and in that his absence, some things became into disarray, and he had to clean house, literally and figuratively. He had to do things with cleaning the house in the temple, the Lord's house, things regarding the offerings for the Levites that weren't being taken care of, addressing the people not keeping and observing the Sabbath, and engaging in mixed marriages, just like was happening 13 years earlier in the book of Ezra. So, what's the style and the structure of the book of Nehemiah? It's written just like the book of Ezra in historical narrative. This is a document talking about the history of real people at a real time in a real place, chronicling the events, telling the events that happened. Interesting aspect of Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, is that it's written in both first and third person. First person meaning Nehemiah is writing about himself. He uses the pronouns I and we. He's talking about him placing himself there. The author is the first person narrator. And then there's the third person narrator who's talking about Nehemiah, saying Nehemiah as he and him. Someone else writing about his life and the events. So what the thought process behind this is that these could be some of Nehemiah's own personal memoirs, journal entries, his records that he wrote, and he included himself in the story. And then there's someone else that has come along as they're compiling all of his notes and all of his journal entries, and they're using his records and potentially Ezra's records and other chronicles around the situation, the history of that situation, and they're compiling it all together into one book. And so therefore you have some of the text written in the first person by Nehemiah and other in the third person by this narrator describing what happened to Nehemiah. The book is pretty midway divided. Chapters 1 through 7 emphasize the reconstruction of the wall around the entire city of Jerusalem. That's the primary emphasis of those chapters. So this is describing physical things, construction and guarding each other so that construction can take place. A lot of practical lessons and leadership lessons in these first 7 chapters. about rebuilding of the wall. There are many prayers chronicled of Nehemiah in this text. So he's very much a man of prayer, but not just a man of prayer, a man of action, to put his prayers into action and to take part, which demonstrates dependence, a strong dependence on the Lord, and also determination to then take his dependence on the Lord and walk out his faith. So quite the incredible pairing there. Leading by example, he's working on the wall himself. He's even giving up his salary as governor. He's a politician. He's a person of fame, even you could say, right there building alongside the rest. The latter chapters, 8 through 13, now that the wall has been finished, focuses more on rebuilding or restoring the people. So a lot more of spiritual lessons, moral lessons, what can be learned from these chapters about restoring the people in a spiritual sense. There's a specific story told that the Torah, the people are gathered to hear the words of the Torah, and it's actually Ezra the scribe that's reading them. And the people stand up to hear the words of the Torah as Ezra opens the book of the Torah of Moshe, and then it's being explained to them, and they're hearing the explanation of the words of the Torah and recognizing their lack, recognizing how they've turned yet again, even after being in captivity and returning. There's still issues that they're working on and failing in and stumbling in. One of which, as I mentioned, is intermarrying with the pagan culture surrounding them. So it's a reminder of the importance of returning to the Torah, returning to God's word, meaning reading it and being reminded of it, because we consistently fall into similar patterns. And without the instruction, the bread of Torah, that Jehovah says, all that proceeds from his mouth is our bread. Without that regular nourishment, then we are likely to return to old patterns. So the reason for repeating the reading and confessing and repenting and returning to the word of Jehovah. So, themes. The purpose of the writing of the book of Nehemiah, you can see in a practical sense. Let's make sure that posterity remembers what these the exiles from Babylon and Persia went through, what they were up against in returning to the land of Judah, in returning to Jerusalem, the mistakes that they made, the ways that they stumbled. Let's record this for future generations. So they're chronicling these events. But as far as lessons go, we learn a lot about Jehovah's favor. I've talked about this in the other lessons, the other books, that he chose to use Cyrus to show his people divine favor, sending them back from captivity to the promised land. He chose Darius to allow them to continue work on the temple building project. He chose Xerxes, who married Esther, to preserve his people. And then now he's choosing Artaxerxes to encourage Nehemiah and Nehemiah to go back and build a wall to guard the city, to guard the people that have already been sent back and protected and preserved. So divine favor is very much a theme of the book of Nehemiah. Because of this divine favor that I think Nehemiah knew, I think we see in Nehemiah a genuine worshiper, like Yeshua mentions in John 4. Jehovah seeking those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. He is a man of prayer and action, dependent on God, determined to walk out his faith in real time. We see that despite walking according to God's purposes and understanding his divine favor given to you, there is very likely, in fact, inevitably, going to be opposition. From the outside, which is a fearful thing, and from the inside, which is a very discouraging thing. We know the attacks from the outside of the surrounding nations, but the reluctance and compromising stature of some of his fellow countrymen is opposition and a discouraging thing. But I think we can also recognize lessons like we learned from Paul later on, that if God is for us, really, who can be against us? if you really know that you are being given divine favor and you have been given a divine instruction, and this is what you need to do in your life, who can really stand against you? And if they do, does it really matter, ultimately? And for that reason, we know that we can overcome. We are more than conquerors, as Paul tells the Romans, but also he tells the Philippians, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Jehovah has sent Nehemiah to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. Therefore, he can do it through God's strength, through dependence on him. Another key theme is restoration, obviously, physically, of the wall around Jerusalem. He's restoring his city and protecting it, but also restoration of the covenant relationship that he wants to have with his people. So that's why there's description of, yes, the wall and restoration of the city, but also there's a description of this event of reading of the Torah and the people returning to the word and returning to that covenant, the covenant words and the covenant relationship with Jehovah, who has preserved them and protected them and brought them to this point. So there's very much a restoration in that way. After all, it's the abandoning of the Torah, the abandoning of the covenant that caused their exile in the first place. So how much more shall their return to the land be accompanied by the return to the Torah, return to the covenant relationship, really, which is what he desired from the very beginning. This is, you could be seen as a second Exodus, leaving a foreign land, this time Persia, instead of the first Exodus being Egypt, but leaving a foreign land, captivity in a foreign land, to be returned and brought into the promised land, which is a promise according to his covenant and comes along with instruction of expectations for what it means to be his holy people, his holy nation, those who are now engaged in a covenant relationship with the creator of the universe. This then is the instruction, which is what Torah means, for how he wants his people to live and walk. And do we not see this from the very same words of after the first Exodus of what he spoke regarding his desire for this redeemed people as he's bringing them into the Holy Land? Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Amen. May Jehovah bless you in the reading of his word. Shalom.